Life Stories presents a journey of strength, self-discovery, and resilience. In today's tale, we follow Rachel, a woman who, after facing betrayal and heartache, embarks on a path to reclaim her life. As she confronts her past and navigates the pain of a broken marriage, Rachel learns that true empowerment comes from within. This story is a reminder that no matter how difficult the road may seem, we all have the ability to rise above and rebuild our lives. So, sit back and join us as we begin Rachel's transformative journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to start today's story. Rachel stood in the soft warmth of the kitchen, a quiet smile forming on her face as she stirred the simmering stew on the stove. The aroma of spices filled the air, wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. The radio played soft love songs in the background, their gentle melodies lifting her spirits despite the growing weight in her chest. Tonight was special, Valentine's Day. A day she had always cherished. Not because of grand gestures or extravagant gifts, but because of what it symbolized. It was a reminder of the love she and James once shared. That love, so full of promise and excitement, had always been a part of her, even in the hardest of times. As she continued to prepare dinner, she reflected on the years that had passed, years filled with laughter, with quiet moments of connection, and even with arguments that they had always worked through. But somewhere along the way, that love had faded. It had become distant, overshadowed by silence, by cold shoulders, and a growing sense of isolation. Rachel knew the intimacy they once shared was slipping through their fingers. Yet she still clung to the belief that there was something worth saving. The kitchen had become her sanctuary in these difficult days. She could not control everything, but she could make the meal that would bring him home to her, to the life they had built together. She had spent the afternoon preparing James's favorite dishes, grilled lamb chops with fragrant rosemary, the jollof rice that she knew he loved, golden plantains that would melt in your mouth, and a delicate strawberry cheesecake that was her specialty. Everything had to be perfect. She wanted him to see, to truly see, the effort she had put into this evening. She needed him to notice her again, to notice her love. The dining room was set, the table decorated with fresh roses, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the pale glow of the candles. She had placed them carefully, making sure the centerpiece was just right. She even put on the dress she had bought for nights like this, hoping that it might remind him of the woman he had once adored. She had done everything right, and as she stared at the table, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, tonight could be the night when they found each other again. The clock ticked past 7, then 8, then 9, still, no sign of James. Her heart, once full of hope and anticipation, slowly began to sink. Anxiety crept in, squeezing at her chest with each passing minute. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing his number. The phone rang endlessly, and then, the voicemail message came on. A soft, heavy sigh escaped her lips, and she sank into a chair. The candle light flickered, casting long shadows across the empty room, and the untouched plates of food before her felt like a cruel reminder of what was missing. This wasn't the first time. Lately, James had become more distant, his presence in the house feeling more like an obligation than a partnership. He no longer laughed with her, no longer asked about her day. He no longer looked at her the way he once did. Rachel had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that it was just a phase, that he was busy with work, or that there was something else weighing on his mind. But with each passing day, the gap between them grew wider, and the silence between them grew louder. She had once believed that love would endure, that it was something that could be rekindled, no matter the obstacles. That belief had kept her going for so long. But tonight, as she sat alone in their beautifully decorated dining room, staring at the food she had made for a man who didn't seem to care enough to show up, doubt crept in. Could love really endure when it felt like it was slipping away? Could she hold on to something that seemed to be falling apart, no matter how hard she tried? Rachel woke up the next morning to the sound of James moving around the room, the noise now more of a routine disruption than anything that brought her comfort. She lay there, watching him as he buttoned his shirt with mechanical precision, his movements absent of the warmth and affection that had once made her heart race. His face, once so full of life, was now cold, distant. He hadn't even acknowledged her presence as he got ready, as though she was nothing more than a fading shadow in his life. The night before, he had come home after midnight, the heavy scent of expensive cologne on him. A scent she did not recognize. A scent that did not belong to her. Rachel had been too exhausted, too emotionally drained to confront him then. She had been too broken, too afraid of the answers that would only bring more pain. She lay there, staring at him, hoping that somehow, those words, "good morning," might bring them back to something that felt real again. Her voice was hesitant, unsure, carrying an edge of hope, as if those simple words could somehow remind him of the love they once shared. James barely spared her a glance as he fastened his watch. "Morning," he muttered, his tone clipped, dismissive. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight, forcing a smile she didn't feel. She tried to remind him of the little things, the things that used to matter, by offering him his favorite breakfast, pancakes and scrambled eggs. But he didn't even pause to appreciate it. "No time. I've got an early meeting," he said, reaching for his briefcase. Her fingers clenched into fists beneath the sheets. There was always a meeting. Always an excuse. "James, is something wrong between us?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. He stopped for a moment, his back still to her, before sighing deeply. "You're overthinking, Rachel. Just focus on running the house. All right?" And just like that, he was gone, leaving behind an aching silence. Rachel lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in her own marriage. Her heart, once so full of love and devotion, felt hollow. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had given so much. And yet here she was, questioning everything she had ever believed in. What had happened to the man who had once held her in his arms and told her that she was his world? Where had that love gone? Days passed, each one slipping by like the last, as Rachel tried to convince herself that things would improve. But deep down, she knew that the warmth that had once been the heartbeat of their marriage was gone. The silence in the house became deafening. She had begun to accept that James had withdrawn, but there was still a part of her that refused to believe that their story was truly over. One morning, as she was preparing breakfast, Rachel caught sight of James through the kitchen window. His car parked outside, the engine still running as he spoke on the phone. She glanced at the clock, 7:30 a.m., a time when he used to be there, enjoying the peaceful mornings they used to share. But now, he was always rushing off to work, his attention elsewhere. He had stopped looking at her, stopped touching her. It was as though he no longer saw her as his partner but as a shadow. Something to be tolerated. She pushed the thoughts aside, trying to focus on the meal she had prepared. But the unease kept building inside her. That afternoon, after another long day of silence between them, she decided to confront him. It had been a long time since she had felt the need to question him. But today, something inside her urged her to ask the questions that had been haunting her for so long. "James, can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He glanced at her, a hint of irritation flashing in his eyes. "About what now, Rachel?" The coldness in his tone stung. But she held her ground. "About you. About us." She paused, trying to gather her thoughts. "What's going on, James? You've been distant lately. We barely talk anymore. And you're always working late. Coming home with that scent on you. That expensive cologne. It's not the one I bought you. Who is she, James?" For a moment, his eyes flashed with something, anger, perhaps guilt, but he quickly masked it with a shrug. "What are you talking about?" he replied, his voice suddenly cold. "You're imagining things. It's just work, Rachel. I've told you this before." Rachel's heart hammered in her chest, the familiar feeling of doubt creeping in. "No, James. This isn't just work. It's more than that. I've seen the way you've been acting. The way you've been avoiding me. I'm not blind." James rubbed his temples as though the conversation was a burden. But Rachel pressed on, needing to understand. "Tell me the truth. Are you seeing someone else?" The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel could feel her breath catch in her throat, the weight of her question hanging between them like an unspoken truth. Finally, he exhaled sharply. Rachel, you need to stop overthinking things. You've been watching too many of those detective shows. There's nothing going on. His voice was dismissive, like her concerns were nothing more than a nuisance. But Rachel wasn't satisfied. She had spent months ignoring the signs, convincing herself that it was just a rough patch. But now, standing in front of James, she knew that she couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. That evening, as James left the house in a hurry, Rachel decided to follow him. She knew it was wrong, knew that she was crossing a line. But the pull of her suspicions was stronger than anything else. She couldn't let it go. She needed to know the truth. She drove slowly, keeping a safe distance behind him as he navigated the city streets. They reached a small cafe, a place Rachel didn't recognize. She parked across the street and waited, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. After a few minutes, she saw him. He was laughing, smiling, his face lit up in a way that it hadn't been in months. But it wasn't just his smile that hit Rachel hard. It was the woman standing next to him. She was tall, with curves that seemed to catch James's attention in a way that Rachel hadn't felt in a long time. She was dressed in a sleek red dress, her laughter light and carefree as she placed her hand on James's arm. Rachel felt her stomach twist in a way that left her breathless. The truth was undeniable now. James wasn't just distant, he was with someone else. The woman who stood so close to him, touching him, laughing with him, was the same woman who had taken the place that Rachel had once held in his life. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She watched them for what felt like an eternity, her heart breaking with each passing second. It was clear now that James had already moved on. He wasn't coming back to her. Not in the way she had hoped. Not in the way she had dreamed. And as the tears threatened to spill, Rachel knew that she had to face the painful truth. Their marriage was over. The drive home that night was the longest Rachel had ever endured. She felt as though the very air inside her car had turned heavy, pressing in on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her mind replayed the image of James with the woman, his laugh, the way he had looked at her. A knot tightened in her stomach. How had she been so blind? How had she failed to see what was so painfully clear now? She pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a few moments. The engine still running, as if hoping that somehow, if she stayed still long enough, everything would go back to the way it was. But she knew that wasn't going to happen. It was over. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had been slipping away from her for so long. And now he had found someone else to give all the things he used to give her: attention, affection, care. And the worst part was, she had allowed herself to believe that there was still a chance. When she stepped into the house, everything felt foreign. The walls, once filled with the warmth of their shared life, now seemed cold and unwelcoming. The scent of his cologne lingered. And for a moment, Rachel almost convinced herself that it was all just a bad dream. But the truth was too real to deny. She had been betrayed, not just by his actions, but by the quiet erosion of their love, piece by piece. And now, she was left to pick up the broken pieces of herself. That night, Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought of all the years she had spent building a life with James. All the sacrifices she had made. All the hopes and dreams they had once shared. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. The man she had spent so many years with was gone. And the person who stood before her now was nothing like the man she had fallen in love with. She had given so much of herself to this marriage. To him. She had molded herself into the perfect partner. Always supporting him. Always putting him first. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten about herself. She had stopped being Rachel, the woman with her own dreams, her own desires. She had become James's wife. A role she had worn like a mask. Until it had consumed her. The next morning, Rachel made a decision. She was done being a shadow in her own life. She was done waiting for James to remember who she was. Done hoping that he would suddenly come to his senses and return to her. It was time to stop waiting for him to fix what he had broken. It was time to fix herself. She reached for her phone and called a close friend. Sarah, someone who had always been there for her. Someone who had seen the strength in her that Rachel had forgotten. The moment Sarah answered, Rachel knew that this was the conversation she had been avoiding. But it was the one she needed most. Sarah, I need your help, Rachel said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. I need to get my life back. I can't keep living like this. Sarah, always the strong one, immediately understood. We'll figure this out. Rachel, you don't have to do this alone. Rachel smiled through the tears that threatened to fall. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. Sarah's support gave her the strength she needed to take the next step. Over the next few days, Rachel focused on herself, on finding the woman she had lost. She began taking small steps, going back to the gym, reading the books she had neglected, and rediscovering the things that made her feel like herself. It wasn't easy. It felt foreign at first. But each day, she grew stronger, and for the first time in months, Rachel felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the days passed, Rachel found a job opportunity that excited her. It wasn't something she had expected, but it was something she had dreamed about, something that could be hers. She didn't need James anymore to feel fulfilled. She was beginning to see that her worth was not tied to him or to their marriage. She had value all on her own. And so, Rachel made the decision to move forward. She was going to build a life for herself. One that didn't rely on James's approval. One that didn't revolve around waiting for him to come back. She was going to thrive, on her terms. In her own way. The woman who had been so lost in her marriage was now finding herself again. And she knew that whatever came next, it would be something she could face with strength and courage. James had taken so much from her. But he had not taken her soul. That, she would keep for herself. As Rachel continued to rebuild her life, the reality of her situation began to take hold in unexpected ways. The more she focused on herself, the clearer it became that she had been living a life that wasn't truly hers. She had spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife, trying to keep the pieces of her marriage together, that she had lost sight of who she was. But now, with each passing day, she felt more empowered, more confident in her own skin. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But Rachel had begun to realize that she didn't need James. She didn't need him to validate her existence, to tell her that she was worthy. She had always been worthy. Rachel knew she couldn't change the past, but she could shape her future. Every step forward was a step away from the woman who had clung to an illusion of love, waiting for someone who didn't care enough to stay. The past was now a distant memory, one that she had learned from, but one she would never return to. And then, the unexpected happened. The first real sign that things were shifting came when Rachel received an email from an executive at a prestigious company, offering her an interview. It was an opportunity she had never dreamed of, a chance to prove herself in a world where her worth wasn't defined by her marriage, but by her skills, her intelligence, her ambition. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt a spark of excitement, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed in her life for years. She spent the next few days preparing. She researched the company, polished her resume, and practiced her interview skills. It was exhilarating to feel the thrill of doing something for herself. For once, the more she worked, the more she realized just how much potential she had always had, how much she had allowed James to suppress in her quest to be the perfect partner. But that version of herself was gone. She was no longer waiting in the shadows for James to notice her. She was stepping into the light, ready to take on the world. The day of the interview arrived, and Rachel felt a sense of calm she had never experienced before. She dressed in a sharp suit, her hair styled with confidence, and her posture tall. She was no longer a woman defined by her marriage. She was Rachel, a woman on her own terms. As she walked into the interview room, the CEO, a well-dressed man named Daniel, stood to greet her with a firm handshake. His presence was commanding, and his gaze was steady, appraising. But Rachel didn't falter. She held his gaze, confident in who she was and what she could offer. As the interview progressed, Daniel seemed impressed. "You don't have corporate experience, but I see potential in you," he said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You've got resilience, and I like that." Rachel couldn't help but smile. She had always been resilient, She had been tested in ways she had never thought possible. And she had survived. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her old life. And now, it seemed, the world was finally starting to recognize her strength. The interview ended, and as she walked out of the room, Rachel felt a surge of hope. She had done it. She had proven that she was more than just a woman scorned by betrayal. She was capable, intelligent, and deserving of the success that had always eluded her. Weeks later, Rachel received a call from the company. She had been offered the job. The excitement she felt was overwhelming. But it wasn't just about the position itself. It was about everything she had overcome to get there. This job wasn't just a new chapter in her career. It was a symbol of her transformation. Of her reclaiming her life and her independence. Rachel's success wasn't just about the job. It was about the way she had rebuilt herself. She had learned to prioritize her own happiness. To choose herself above all else. She had realized that her worth wasn't tied to anyone else. And that was the greatest victory of all. As she settled into her new role, the days began to feel fuller, richer, more rewarding. She no longer found herself thinking about James. About the man who had betrayed her. He was no longer part of her story. Her story was now hers to tell. And the best part was, she was no longer alone. She had herself, and that was more than enough. As Rachel continued to rise in her career, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The pain of her past had shaped her. Yes. But it no longer defined her. She was no longer a woman waiting in the shadows, hoping for someone else's love or approval. She had learned the hardest lessons of all, about self-worth, resilience, and the importance of walking away from situations that drained her. James, who had once been the center of her world, had become nothing more than a fleeting memory. She had spent years investing in a relationship that had failed her. But through it all, Rachel had found the strength to rebuild herself, to rise from the ashes. She had become a woman who not only survived but thrived. Her success, her confidence, and her newfound independence were the rewards she had earned through her own perseverance. And as Rachel sat in her new office, looking out over the city that had once seemed so distant, she smiled. She had found herself again. And she was proud of the woman she had become. The best revenge was never about seeking destruction. It was about thriving and proving to herself that she was enough. Just as she was. If you've enjoyed Rachel's journey and learned something meaningful from her story, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring videos. Each story is a testament to resilience, growth, and the power we all have within us to rewrite our own destinies. Thank you for joining us on this journey. And stay tuned for our next video.